You came across an interesting podcast, eh? Got you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I used to watch, I can't, Two Horse Apocalypse or something. What is it? With Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein, the two brothers.
Mhm.
Watched that quite a while ago. And just this morning, I watched, is it Chris
Chris
Williamson, Modern Wisdom, his podcast. I
Yep.
watched an interview, recent one with Eric Weinstein, and it pretty much blew me away. Um, and I don't want it to sound like arrogant, but there's things in that interview that I really have been thinking about, or that I read from what I consider now to be some of my favorite authors many, many, many years ago. And it's very gratifying. And Eric obviously explains this stuff way beyond what I can with like very legitimate language. But for example, one of the things that he's going on about is that we're so destructive that very, very soon, if not already, people will be able to obtain the power to destroy massive segments of the planet through nuclear or biological weaponry. And this is something that I learned to call the nuclear decision threshold when I was a late teenager. So, this is the concept that we live in not a civilization. Is it the Kardashev scale? There's like,
Yeah, yeah.
we're not even a civilization 1.0 yet. We're like 0 point something.
Mhm.
And what this literature taught me was that a civilization that is not yet it's not yet civilized will self-destruct completely, like the myth or the legend of Atlantis, right? This amazing futuristic place that was destroyed. Supposedly they blew themselves up or they couldn't defend themselves or something. And that was just one little tidbit in Eric Weinstein's this interview. And he really helps very intelligent people, hopefully, to realize and appreciate how messed up. See, I don't have the sophisticated verbiage to be able to explain it. It sounds trite. So I would suggest for listeners to go and watch that podcast. Um, um, he's so on point for the calamity, the horror that is current society. He even sees that there's an acceleration over the past 5 years where nothing makes sense, everything is fake. One of the expressions he uses is called pre-bunking malinformation.
Yeah.
Malinformation is where the information is true, it's accurate, but the establishment or the powers that be, it's a threat to them, to their programs, to what they're trying to achieve. Therefore, they're not going to they can't debunk it because it's true. But they don't want a person like Eric to be able to get the word out. So they will
Pre-bunk.
pre-frame him, and effectively we can think of it as character assassination.
Yep.
Right? So if you take someone out through negative social press, which happens to a lot of these such folks, then you are pre-bunking the malinformation, the true information that you don't want to get out there because it's bad for your program, it's bad for your campaign or operation. And again, just one concept that, yeah, that makes so much sense. There's a word for it. That's amazing. It's better than just character assassination. This is pre-bunking malinformation. And it goes on. And I'm like, about on hour number 2, it's a 3-hour podcast. I'll watch the rest of it this evening. Recommended and helps reflection. And you made the point just before we started recording isn't it good that that these kind of things have so many viewers? They have so many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views. So it shows that there is some level of clarity and
Mhm.
rationality that is getting out into the masses because millions of people. Um, I don't know what that amounts to. What do we need as a tipping point for society to stop and realize and make a change before we careen into the brick wall that's in front of us in so many ways? Um, Trying to not to get too political, kind of try and keep it generic, but
Yeah.
many people should appreciate that one way or another, we think things are messed up.
Well, right, and I mean, that does point to something very pragmatic about solving problems, and if you don't know what the fucking problems are, then you've got serious problems because you can't even begin to make, any headway towards solutions, right? Or when you don't agree on what the problems are, which is where we've kinda landed, in the socio-political world, but to your point, a couple of things, come to mind, and I did listen to that podcast, the pre-bunking. When that really hit me was this idea of wherever whatever time period you're living in, you're never quite conscious of in the way that you are of like the past, right? We can look back on the past and have this sort of somewhat objective viewpoint, right? And of course, after the fact, things come out in time, information gets finally leaked into the public from the private sector, the government, whatever. But if you think of stuff like we now know, for example, that there was a plot that somewhat involved the US government to kill John F. Kennedy, right? That's pretty much proven at this point that there was some help from inside to make that happen, right? Which is just horrifying to think, right? Um, we know that we had programs, MK Ultra, for example, like in the 50s to try to use mind control and psychedelics and shit they were doing. That was primitive. That was with primitive technology, comparatively speaking, to now. What do you think governments are doing now with modern mass media, social media? You think they don't have all the information that Facebook and Google do? The intelligence agencies, at least, right? The higher ranking military officials, like, of course they fucking do. Of course they know what's available. Of course they know the power of this thing and what it can move and what it can't, and how it can move people and how it like. So I think what we've seen is kind of a bit of an end game for elites, right? Elites have been playing the information game for thousands of years, right? It goes all the way back, right? What kings and queens and pharaohs did this. They knew they had to control the narrative, right? What was the narrative? The pharaoh's a god, right? That's a narrative. That's a story they told the public. That came from them, right? And they continued to back it up in different ways with adultery, with ceremony, with whatever, right? Cuneiform tablets, like, and then of course, the first big innovation here in the information game was the printing press. Well, I guess you could say the very first one is writing, of course, right? Like the written word and being able to disseminate information via books. But the printing press was the first mass media, right? That's when, as a king, you could have somebody write a book and get it out to everybody in your country, everybody around the world, even, at a relatively reasonable cost. So that was huge. And that goes on for a few hundred years. But in the last 100 years, like everything's changed. The advent of radio alone was big, but then television's like an order of magnitude. And I would say social media and the internet's another order of magnitude, and AI is another order of magnitude. And that's in this time frame, right? So you got printing press, several hundred years,
Mhm.
radio, telegraphs, right? And then it's like radio, TV, internet, AI, and they get closer and closer together. So we know this stuff's being used. It's not a conspiracy. That's not tinfoil hat. I mean, we know it. We know it's being used to influence elections. It's being used to influence, what the public thinks, public opinion. It's heavily targeted. Um, I worked with somebody once who worked for one of these hardcore high-end DC data firms like Cambridge Analytica, but it wasn't, she was part of a boutique firm. The data she had, she was working with my Wordly startup, and she was talking about, like, who do you want to get in front of? And I was like, well, I don't know, it's our target. She's like, no, 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 no. Like, I can get us in front of people at halftime watching the Alabama football game who are males 20 to 27, like, like that granular, right? And this stuff. So I absolutely think that's happening. And the antidote is thinking, right? Thinking for yourself, not allowing your opinions to be fed to you. Because when you allow others to determine your opinions, which is what most people do, they either get them from their parents or their teachers or whatever, but they don't actually form them, right? If you step back and you say, when did you decide that you were a Republican or a Democrat or whatever? That it doesn't happen. So, but that leads me to what I was saying at the beginning, which is that now we're so lost in many ways, we just don't even agree on the problems. And that's crazy, right? It's just crazy.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff there. I remember studying early in my days of studying marketing. I came across this guy, Edward Bernays, who's the nephew or something of Sigmund Freud. So he had that influence in terms of psychology. Edward Bernays brought the concept of propaganda and he called it propaganda in the US, and he helped politicians and companies to do
Yep.
their stuff. The some fruit company of somewhere in Latin America, and politicians in the US and this kind of stuff. And eventually he wanted to call it propaganda because that's what it was. And then eventually he realized that there's a lot of pushback in the US because they demonized the word propaganda because they said that's a German Nazi thing. So we don't want propaganda because it's bad. And so then they ended up calling it public relations, right? So PR. This is literally, he's known as the grandfather of modern public relations, but it
Which is
is,
propaganda.
it's propaganda, just repackaged, renamed. Um, interesting, interestingly, I'm curious about the percentages because when we talk like this, it feels like we're wearing masks and we're having to filter because we don't know who the audiences are,
Mm.
and we want to be sensitive to people having legitimately different ideas. You said people should think for themselves. It's the hardest thing for anyone to do. Do I know that I'm thinking for myself? How do I know that I haven't been mega programmed by a whole bunch of experiences that are continuously dripped to me since I was young, including Walt Disney movies and um, like childhood programs all the way to now in the newspapers and what, Fox News and CNN, whichever one's your flavor, it's still programming. So it's like you got to choose your programming. Um, One idea I had for a platform, this idea of a decentralized social network, let's say, is a button that is the opposite button. So whatever you curate based on the algorithms, like if I like a particular political bent and these topics, this is what ends up getting fed to me. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like my model of the world is that because I've clicked on it and I've commented on it. And so I'm building my own reality bubble. So the opposite button is you click that and it shows you everything opposite to what your algorithm has trained. And so you can spend time at the completely other end of the spectrum for these different topics and experience things from the other people's perspective. I wonder what that would do to people. Like it would fry their brain of thinking, like they'd think that they're in a parallel universe because most people do not think about what we're talking about here. They don't even question the question. They don't wonder, am I thinking for myself? They just they curate an experience based on their propensities or how they're manipulated, and that's what they see as that's the model of reality. So it'd be amazing for them to have that button, the opposite button. I saw Andrew Yang on listened to him, I think speaking with Rupert Sheldrake or someone, um, I think I got those mixed up. But it's Andrew Yang. Oh, talking to Peter Diamandis. He's an entrepreneurial Democrat, and he's in favor of universal basic income. And that was eye-opening, because he's supposedly an again entrepreneur, and he's trying to he says, if we can get ballots that are not left right, part of it is that there's 50%, supposedly 50% of independents. I think it was Andrew Yang. He said the controlling groups are only about 10% representative of the entire US. So when you got a party that wins, it's only reflective of about 10% of the people. So he says his solution is to get rid of the left right and just have everyone available, everyone's on the ballot, and then everyone can go in and vote. And we're going to get a much truer sense of the issues and the balances. It's, again, controlled opposition. So yeah, few reflections there. Everything is propaganda since the 1920s. How do you know if you're thinking for yourself? Big question.
Well, I mean, it can be, there's ways, right, that you can kind of practice. One of them's the why game, right? So we say, okay, I believe that global warming is a serious problem. Okay. And just ask yourself, well, why do you believe that? Well, because there's a lot of science that says that. Okay. Have you read the science, or did you hear that somewhere? So why do you believe that? Well, because I read the science. Okay. Well, in that case, maybe you did arrive at that decision on your own. But if it's, well, I heard that there's a lot of science behind it from other people, or read it, or articles I read on the internet. It's like, well, did you ever check to see if anything they said was true? How do you know that, so on and so forth. And so you just question your assumptions, and you try to go all the way back to the base, sort of like find out where the opinion started. That's the smoking gun, right? Where's the origin of it? When did you come to consider this opinion to be yours, to be solid, right? When did you arrive at this conclusion? Was it a conversation with a single person? Okay. Again, did you ever investigate it, or did you take them at their word? Right. That's a very easy way to do it. And really all it is, when I say think for yourself, I think the better way to say that is, do you question your assumptions? Do you ever
Mhm.
question your assumptions? Do you ever kind of play devil's advocate with yourself? Like, that's the starting point, because I have an experiment going on Twitter right now that is the classic of this. I actually stumbled into this by accident. I really didn't mean to. Somebody, it ended up in my Twitter timeline. I didn't really look to see who it was from. It was this post about all these illegal immigrants and da 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 da, and the classic American nonsense. And I was just like, this is garbage, And so I responded to it, basically saying the truth from data, that immigration's actually, I mean, arguably America's superpower, and the reason why we've become the most successful society in human history. But specifically, it is a massive net positive. We have a lot of lies, like that it causes lots of crime. It's actually not true. It's the opposite. In fact, places where there are lots of recent immigrants tend to have lower violent crime rates and lower overall crime rates, for example. Um, well, they come here and they work and they send all their money home. Not true. That's only about 15% that they actually send home. They still spend money here. They contribute to the economy. And the only reason why you're not getting more of that is because you're pissing and moaning and not putting together reasonable immigration so they can be legit. And then they would be paying taxes and so on and so forth. But, just all these myths. And so I was putting that out there, and I was showing people research studies and factual data, but they don't care.
Mm.
It just goes ad hominem, you know. Well, how many immigrants do you live next door to? Right. So that was a guy say, well, you're not from Texas, you're from Maryland. He saw my thing. Well, actually, sir, 17% of Texas are immigrants, is made up of immigrant population, 15% in Maryland. I don't think that's a material difference. So yes, I'm living in the same world you are. You're not exactly swimming with Mexican immigrants, laying on your backyard pool, okay? Like, relax. But it's all emotion and it's all propaganda. Like you're saying, it's all stuff that's been fed to them, lies they've been told. But when you're in pain and you're not doing well, you'll believe anything as long as it's not you, scapegoats, right? That's a classic PR move. Lay the blame at somebody else's feet, preferably an enemy, right? And there you go. Your hands are clean. You're not repressing people's wages in the United States like corporations actually have done for 50 years. They're the reason you don't have any money, but hey, let's blame immigrants. That's better than you demanding that corporates actually pay their wages, right? Like nobody wants that. I don't know. It's just it's hard stuff.
So yeah, so there ends up being layers. So Eric Weinstein, he didn't explain these, but he says there's four variables to live by, and they are truth, meaning, and to me, there's like relatively similar. So he didn't really explain what he meant exactly by those, but truth, meaning, fitness, and grace. It's
Hmm.
a very nice, interesting list of stuff. Grace, he was talking about transcendence, right? He's talking
Yeah.
about majestic architectural buildings and music and this kind of stuff. And he says that's a quality of life that we need to live by. And then fitness, I guess, health, looking after yourself, and then this truth and meaning. Meaning for me reminds me of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning,
Hmm.
um, and like purpose, meaningful existence, justifying the why that we're here. And then truth is kind of like honesty and fact and integrity. Yeah. I'll make that distinction there. So that was nice. He also said, basically, this is the other thing that I've been looking at for a long time. And Martin Armstrong, the only economist that I value, um, he says the same thing. He talks about confidence in institutions. He
Hmm.
says when confidence finally collapses, that's when the empire dies.
Sure.
And both of them are talking about that as happening at the moment. Eric Weinstein, very interesting at the beginning, what hooked me at the beginning of the podcast was he said he's been hanging out with ultra millionaires and billionaires, and they all have a similar scarcity mindset. They're all scared and they don't know who to trust, what to believe. They don't trust any of the institutions. They don't trust the newspapers, the magazines, the journals, the science, whether it's science or business, Newsweek, Nature magazine, Lancet Science. The people who have the money, they aren't buying anything being published by anyone at the moment. That's,
Right.
to me, that's pretty astonishing. And he's also saying they're concerned about, just like we are, what's the economy going to be like in 5 years? Inflation and living expenses and job opportunity. He says the billionaires are kind of freaked out about this very similar kind of stuff as well. That was really interesting. But fundamentally, confidence in institutions, when that collapses, that's the death of the empire. And to me and Martin Armstrong, what he's been saying for a long time, this decade is that decade.
Huh. I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. I think that's interesting. I do think it's a little scary, the billionaire thing, because I do recall that part too, and that definitely hit me as like, whoa. And they're all basically preparing for a sort of mini apocalypse in that they don't think it's going to be like the end of civilization or the end of the world, but that there's going to be probably a good 6 to 18 month time period where you're going to need to just hole up and stay the fuck away from everybody
Yeah.
until the bloodbath ends, and then we'll be able to actually clean up and start over and do shit right. And unfortunately, where we're heading right now, if you look at the political charge, and it's not just the United States, right? It's all throughout the world, really. Populist movements are on the rise way more than they were 20, 30 years ago. Um, Conservative, hardline, a racist sort of bigotry kind of politics is in favor. Everybody's afraid of the other. Um, that is a terrible environment to usher in the era of AI when we need the most sane policy making we've probably ever needed, right? do you trust these institutions that people don't even trust to give them basic information to navigate 85 million jobs lost? Because I know that whole thing about the jobs being created, but let's face it, dude, they're not gonna coincide. It won't be like that. At first, it'll be the job loss, and then the AI jobs will sort of build up on the back end. That's how it goes. But we're gonna see some cliffs first. And
Mm.
our governments aren't going to be wise enough to navigate that. Our populations aren't going to be. You know, we have too many outdated assumptions about work and contribution and what's fair and what isn't. And I mean, you know, it's crazy. So yeah, they're probably right. I mean, this is when you need institutions the most, right? Institutions, their real value is to help you navigate tough times, right? To be the um, leveling effect, if you will, right? To provide that safety net, as it's called, or, you know, that social support. And if our institutions are reeling, they're about to take a knockout punch, I think.
Yeah. And we can, we can, I guess, gradually with the exit strategy, we're going to slowly unpeel our own opinions and things. You just mentioned a word, you said populist movements.
Mhm.
Well, let's define what that means sometime because I hear different stories on that too. Um, it might be that populist means popular amongst the commoners. Well, that used to be called a democracy, right?
Mhm.
So, so let's start to go down these rabbit holes over a very long period of time whilst we're actually navigating opportunity and things. For the AI, yeah, it's I always come back to the acronym in computer language of GIGO, and I have this conversation about intuition. People say you got to trust your intuition, and I say, well, if you've been filling up your system, your energy system, your mind, your subconscious with garbage for the past 30 years, then your intuition is going to be garbage.
Yep.
So it's garbage in, garbage out, and it's the same with AI. If your knowledge models, knowledge graphs, are um, highly politicized, if they're bent, if they're biased, if it's biased data, if it's skewed data, then the results that you're going to get obviously is going to be garbage. So there's going to be a battle of the AIs. It's which platform, which AI do you want to, again, which one fits your bias? Because that ends up being the one that we trust the most. This one is true and factual because I agree with it.
Oh boy. Well, this is a different kind of exit strategy. So, you know, depending on what you're thinking, maybe some of you are going to pile up the canned goods. I don't know. Gav looks pretty set. I'm hoping we're on good terms. I'm probably heading to him because I'm too close to DC. I'm sure this will be a shit show over here. Um, but yeah, I don't know, man. It's a nutty, nutty world, and I think it points to, you know, if I could bring it back to a lot of the things we talk about, resilience, um, being get you have to get good at managing change. Period. 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 You have to be constantly developing your skill set. That's just the world we're in. You can't just sit on your laurels. You can't just expect to learn one thing and do it for 30, 40 years. Like that was gone for our generation. It's absolutely gone for everybody after us. I would be hard pressed. I bet not even 1 in 1,000 millennials will work in a job for more than 10 years. I bet it'll be that low. It'll be less than 1%. A tenth of 1% will ever work in a job for 10 years straight. That's not a company they own, like for someone else. I don't see it anymore. It's too, I don't even know if businesses are going to survive that long. I think we're going to see a lot of businesses, like we're going to see a new type of business cycle, and like people aren't going to ride it out. They're going to like anticipate it. It's going to be expected. Like, hey, this business plan is come in, blow up, exit. Because we
Mm.
know it's not long term, right? We know it's gonna get, obsoleted. We might even do, that sort of, what do they call it? Self-obsolescence, what's the word?
Mhm.
They have they have a term for it.
Not manufactured.
Yeah, but it's basically when a company does it on purpose,
Yeah, yeah.
you know? Yeah, it's gonna drive me crazy, but I think it's like forced obsolescence or something along those lines, but, you know, you basically just your technology, this is famous in the computer chip industry with Intel. They're so far ahead. Like, we don't need their chips in consumer computers at this point. We'd be fine with the fifth generation, but they're not because they get all this R&D, and it's like they got to unload these things. Forced obsolescence. I think that's what it's actually called.
Or
And so what they do is they stop supporting you. That's what it is. That Intel says, well, no more drivers, no more firmware for those chips. And oh, by the way, they don't work with Windows they're not going to work with the next version of Windows. So you're screwed. And they force you into obsolescence, even though you're happy with the performance. It's plenty of computer for what you do, which is yell at people on the internet occasionally and surf your, forums that agree with you. Right. Like, so yeah, strange new world. So
planned obsolescence, I think,
planned.
probably
There you
is
go.
the thing. So one last thing that Eric says on the cast is you need to have head, heart. You need to be led by the combination of your head, your heart, and your loins. And that was pretty entertaining, pretty interesting
Head,
segment.
heart, and loins.
Loins. So that combination of those three, um, because then you got the passion, the compassion, um, the individuated motivation. You got the rationality is in the
Rationality,
head.
yeah.
So and he says basically almost no one operates with that. He makes the point of the mobile phone, right? He says your phone is not a phone; it's a environment or it's something. Um, and so we're getting all our stimuli there, and we're forgetting disconnection in the real world in so many levels. Um,
Hmm.
Manipulated by the reality bubbles that the algorithms push us into, and we're forgetting we're forgetting a lot on how to be ourselves and connect with other people. So again, simple messages. If this stuff is new for the listener, then hopefully you're going to wake up from this kind of a conversation and go and actually start doing that research. If you've heard this before, then you're part of the reality bubble you're just in the same reality bubble that we've been in. But I do recommend that particular podcast. Really fantastic with Eric and Chris Williamson.
Williamson. Yeah. We'll link
Uh,
it. We'll try to remember to link it in the
yeah.
video in the notes.